Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. A lot of you have already joined in, and we'll be excited when more people come in. We have a great event today. I'm Carol Decker with the West Newbury Wild and Native, one of the sponsors of this event, along with our West Newbury Open Space Committee and the Essex County Greenbelt Association, our local land trust that serves the cities and towns of Essex County. We're grateful to Greenbelt for all their work helping us promote this event. Today's program includes closed captioning, which is optional. You can toggle it on and off at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for Emily, which we will take at the end of the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, because this allows us to keep track of all the questions which Patricia Reeser, who is joining us along with myself, will present to Emily. I also want to tell you about West Newbury Wild and Native, which is a group of residents from West Newbury and adjacent towns passionate about promoting native plants, pollinators, and wildlife-friendly gardening, as well as controlling non-native invasive plants. We believe preservation of our wild and native lands is best done one yard at a time, one landscape at a time, and every gardener and landowner should be empowered to rebuild and restore healthy ecosystems. Thus, we are very pleased to welcome Emily May, a biologist with the Xerces Societies for Invertebrate Conservation, for this important presentation about supporting pollinators and other wildlife in our yards and gardens through the changing seasons. Emily is a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society's pesticide program. She received her Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, native bee nesting habitats, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. It's so important we learn how to build resilience into our yards and especially rethink the old ideas of fall-winter garden aesthetics so we can better support the natural world. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about fall gardening. My name's Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation biologist with the pesticide program at the Xerces Society. And this is really great timing for this. I've given this presentation at other times of year, but really it's best right now before we start our yard cleanup. And it's almost the start of fall because the equinox is this Sunday. So it's hard to choose among seasons, but fall is really a great season, and it's a great season in Essex County. So I'm excited to share information with you on caring for pollinator habitat as we go into the fall and winter, and how that can look different in some cases from what you're doing in your vegetable gardens. We're going to talk about what happens to pollinators and other insects in the fall and winter, and try and understand all the seasons of their lives so that we can support their populations all year round. And then we'll dive into how we can adapt our gardening practices and aesthetics throughout the year to build more resilient gardens. So if you're not familiar with Xerces, we are named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly known to go extinct through human activity in the United States. We're a nonprofit founded as an organization of butterfly scientists, but our mission has expanded to conserving all invertebrates and their habitats. And we have currently staff in over 20 states. I'm actually based just north of you in Vermont in the Champlain Valley, and I've been with Xerces for about a decade. I wanted to give a shout out before I started to Xerces partners, including our members, volunteers, other supporters, and collaborators, and people like you who are acting to protect invertebrates and pollinators in particular in your neighborhoods. We can't do what we do without you, so thank you very much for having me here to talk. So here's a little outline for today for what we're going to talk about over the next hour. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll dive into fall and winter habitat, including some insect life histories, talk about leaving the leaves and saving the stems. We'll then talk about some fall garden tasks for pollinator habitat and our vegetable gardens, and then talk a little bit about the paradigm shift and garden goals. So I'll end with some resources and Q&A. So let's dive in. I figure since you're here, you're already aware of the issues that insects are facing and their ecological importance. So insects may be small, but they play this incredibly important role in our ecosystems. They are breaking down dead plant material and animals, returning nutrients to the soil. They're offering free pest control, keeping the balance of things in check. And they're the base of the animal food web, serving as food for other animals. They also are helping plants reproduce, so trees and shrubs, wildflowers, fruit and vegetable plants. But they are facing tough times due to a variety of things: habitat loss, climate change, pesticide use, diseases. So, what can we do as individuals to support them? The thing I really love about pollinators is they have this, it's a tractable problem. It's something each of us can do to help. Gardening for wildlife can be a really important contributor to the stressors that pollinators and other animals are facing. Insects and other wildlife aren't just these passing visitors to our garden. They are vital components of a healthy and functioning ecosystem, and yards and gardens are part of that. Resilient gardening isn't just about creating beautiful gardens, although that can be part of it. It's about fostering habitats that support a diverse range of species, from pollinators to birds and beneficial insects. So, what does resilient gardening look like? It looks like a focus on biodiversity, so choosing a wide variety of native plants to support local wildlife and provide food and shelter throughout the year. That doesn't mean that you have to only plant native species, but if you're gardening for wildlife and for resilience, native plants usually provide that best value because of the deep relationships that those plants have with species that have lived with them for many lifetimes. So, as gardeners that are focused on resilience, those are some of the things we're thinking about. We also are using ecologically based pest management, lending a hand to beneficial insects so they can lend us a hand with pest control, and creating gardens that have year-round appeal, not just for us, but for other animals. So from spring blossoms to winter seed heads. So before we dive into fall, I just wanted to remind ourselves about taking a step back to the key elements of habitat for pollinators and other wildlife. It's always just helpful to kind of be grounded in how our gardens are supporting pollinators through their whole life cycle. So the things that habitat contains are food. So for pollinators, that's nectar and pollen-rich plants with continuous bloom, overlapping bloom periods from spring through fall, and then some larval host plants for butterflies. And then shelter, so nesting sites and overwintering sites, refuge from disturbance, and disturbance can include fall garden cleanup. Protection from pesticides is also a key part of this as well. There's a lot of hidden pesticide risks in home and garden spaces. Residential spaces have a quarter of all insecticide use across the country. So it's important for us to be careful and aware of how we're protecting our pollinator and wildlife habitat from that risk as well. But let's talk about fall. When we think about pollinator gardens, we often start by thinking about the flowers that are there, what they look like, what they're providing through the spring, through the early fall. But pollinator life cycles don't actually stop this month. Nesting and overwintering habitat is a critical contributor to the annual life cycle of these insects. Doug Tallamy, the author, has said, unfortunately, the biggest threat to overwintering insects doesn't come from the weather, it comes from us as we are striving to clean up our flower beds and lawns and meadows. A little knowledge about how insects spend the winter can help us avoid killing them unintentionally. So let's talk about that. Let's talk a little more about the protection of this habitat, and we can save talking about floral resources for another time. So where do other insects and other invertebrates go in the winter? The vast majority of them overwinter or spend the winter right where they spent all summer, just less active and more hidden. Many invertebrates rely on fallen leaves and other organic debris to cover and insulate them from the winter. So whatever your landscape, you can ensure that some of these resources are available. These lunar moths are an example of an insect that disguises their cocoons in dried leaves. They blend in with the real leaves. Luna moths are found in most deciduous forests of eastern North America, as far north as Canada and as far south as northern Mexico. Luna moth eggs are actually smaller than the head of a pin. They're tiny, and they're white and faintly oval shaped, and they're coated in a little brown adhesive that helps them cling to a plant. So as winter approaches and the leaves fall, Luna moth pupae will then overwinter hidden in their cocoons in the leaf litter. This is a morning cloak butterfly, which is a large butterfly with yellow-white wing edges. It's one of the first butterflies that you'll see in the spring in Massachusetts. It emerges on some of the first warm days, often before even the snow has melted. These adults actually hibernate through the winter here in New England. So this and several other species of butterflies, including the eastern comma and the question mark butterflies, have evolved the capability to produce an antifreeze agent, which stops ice crystals from forming in their body if temperatures are below freezing. Morning cloak adults spend the winter in a sheltered place, like a rock crevice, under the bark of a tree, or under a leaf or in a wood pile. So they are actually feeding when they come out on mostly on tree sap from oaks. They will also feed sometimes on decaying things and animal droppings, but they're the first ones you'll often see in the springtime. Red banded hair streaks lay their eggs on fallen oak leaves, which then become the first food for the caterpillars when they emerge. This is a southeastern species, so it's not up with us. We have up here the coral hair streak, which lays its eggs on twigs or leaf litter at the base of cherries or hickories. We have the hickory hair streak, which overwinters as eggs laid on the leaves of hickory and ash and oak trees. So caterpillars are hiding in the leaf litter during the day and emerging at night to feed on leaves and fruit. This is the chrysalis of a tiger swallowtail butterfly. The swallowtail butterflies are among those that disguise their chrysalises as dried leaves and blend in with the real leaves. Very different from the very showy adult swallowtail butterflies that you'll see around in the summer. Swallowtails overwinter as a chrysalis in a state of diapause, which is like an insect version of hibernation. And the larvae that experience the shortening days of late summer will enter diapause after they go into their pupal phase. The pupae stop developing and they will wait for day length to start increasing again, as well as getting some warmer temperatures, and then they'll come out in the spring. This is the adult of the great spangled fritillary butterfly, which is a large and gorgeous fritillary butterfly. It spends the winter as a newly hatched caterpillar hidden in the leaf litter. So you're starting to see here that there's some differences in what stage of life these insects are overwintering in. But they're all kind of using this leaf litter and other ways of disguising themselves around the debris in the yard to be able to make it safely through the winter. So the mom, in this case, lays eggs near or on the base of violets in the spring and in the fall, excuse me. The caterpillar emerges from that egg, but doesn't actually eat the violets until the following spring when the leaves are fresh. It spends the winter as that caterpillar, and then as the violet starts emerging, the caterpillar starts to eat those violet leaves and grow. Like many other insects that are overwintering in this kind of debris, the secret weapon for survival is really extreme secrecy. The caterpillars of this species are hiding in leaves during the day. They're only returning to their food plants to feed in the nighttime. It's actually really difficult to even find a photo of a great spangled fritillary caterpillar. This is a Polyphemus moth. You might recognize this one. It's so gorgeous. It's named after Polyphemus, the giant cyclops from Greek mythology. And this one emerged in May in the Midwest from its silk cocoon. So we get one brood per year north of Pennsylvania of this species. And the females are laying their eggs on a wide variety of deciduous trees, oaks, maples, willows, birch. The Polyphemus caterpillars will eat an entire leaf and then snip it off at the petiole, the stem, which is maybe a protective behavior that helps protect against predators who are looking for leaf damage as a sign of where caterpillars might be. And the reason I brought this one in is because they have these awesome cocoons, which obviously look quite a bit like leaves. They are a wonderful disguise. So they can sometimes be found attached like this to a twig, and they can also be found on the ground among the leaves that have fallen from trees. This is another place you might find them spun onto a twig. This is another camouflaged moth. This is a six-spotted gray, which feeds on dogbane as larvae. And these are, this is one of many brown moths and butterflies. the species that are often using leaves for cover and shelter. There's lots of other kinds of arthropods that need that kind of leaf cover and shelter. So this is the leaf litter crab spider. Can you spot it? It's right there. About 85% of overwintering spiders spend their winter under leaf litter or in soil or under bark at various stages of their life. Many are overwintering in egg sacs or as little spiderlings with their legs pulled in tightly to their bodies. And like other things I've mentioned, like the morning cloak butterfly, many overwintering spiders build up antifreeze, glycol compounds, in their tissues as they're exposed to gradually cooling temperatures in the fall, allowing them to sort of get super cooled without actually freezing over the winter. Spiders are some of our best fighters when it comes to ecological pest control. So maintaining diversity of spiders with all their different types of prey and hunting strategies is one of the ways that we can sort of lend a hand to these arthropods to help us keep potential pest insects in our gardens at bay. This is another great fighter when it comes to beneficial insects. This is a ground beetle. This is a common and diverse group of insects that also are found in leaf litter and at sort of the soil surface. Many hundreds of species of ground beetle in the US, just an incredible diversity. And these beetles are important biological control agents in agriculture and gardens, controlling insect pests. They also, in many cases, consume weed seeds on the soil surface. So they're both combating insect pests as well as weed species. So things like crabgrass, velvet leaf, lamb's quarter, these kinds of ground beetles can be helpful in keeping those in check as well. The larvae of these species live in the soil surface or in leaf litter. Many overwinter as adults in the soil. So these are some of those insects that benefit from our mess. And then here's one of the last ones I'll show. This is a northern walking stick. This is another insect dependent on leaf litter at some point. And these are mostly wingless insects that graze on the leaves of a variety of different kinds of trees. They don't really cover a lot of ground and you don't see a lot of damage from them. So you often don't see them at all. Northern walking stick adults are way up in trees. They're mature in late summer and early fall. And female stick insects will go up to the top of a tree and drop more than 100 eggs from the top of that tree. So they kind of fall all over the place under the tree. And the eggs fall to the ground and overwinter in the leaf litter until spring. Those eggs look quite a bit like plant seeds, and a portion of the outside of the egg is edible, which mimics a similar area on the outside of plant seeds that depend on ants for distribution. So what happens with walking stick eggs is ants will haul the eggs, as well as other plant seeds, back to their nest underground. They'll eat the edible part and toss or bury the rest into their waste heap. So in the springtime, those walking sticks hatch safely below ground and then walk out of the anthill. So this actually sort of triple interaction that's happening. Many things going on in the story of a walking stick that we really just aren't paying attention to most of the time. We're not seeing it happen, but we just have to believe it's there. So this is the last one I'll talk about. This is bumblebees. And this is a graphic showing the full life cycle of a bumblebee, starting with the early spring queen over on the left-hand part of that picture, founding the initial nest, building up the colony over the summer with new daughters who are helping to forage and tend to the nest, and then having newly produced queens and males leaving the nest and mating. Those new mated queens building up energy stores on fall forage like goldenrods and asters, and then finding a suitable place for overwintering. Bumblebees live on an annual cycle. So the old queen will die at the end of the year. The new queens overwinter in hibernacula, which are short burrows in the soil. We don't know that much about where all these species like to overwinter, but typically, under trees, in rotten wood, under leaf litter. They've been found in a variety of different places. But they like a little bit of mess. They can be very shallow and almost at the surface. So I'm hoping this will work. It looks like it's playing. This is a video of a new queen of a common eastern bumblebee excavating a hibernaculum under a thin layer of leaf litter and pine needles. That was taken by a colleague of mine, Jenny, who's one of our bumblebee specialists. So all of those insects and spiders and other arthropods need habitat, and most are using leaf litter, or standing vegetation to complete their life cycles. So many invertebrates rely on fallen leaves. So if you came to this presentation thinking I was going to give you a ton of homework for your fall garden, I really have great news for you because I'm actually here to tell you you can do more by doing less. The best way to conserve this really important segment of the animal world is to leave the leaves, or at least some of them, to provide that overwintering and nesting habitat for these insects. So let's talk about how to do that. The leaves don't need to be left exactly where they fall to be able to provide some of that cover and overwintering habitat. Too thick of a layer of leaves can smother grass. So if you're wanting to keep some areas of grass open, you can sort of lightly rake them or otherwise corral them into your garden beds around tree bases or in other designated areas where they can break down, suppress weeds, retain moisture, and provide those nutrients back to the soil. There's been some research done on this. So if you're wanting to protect insects and eggs present in the leaf litter, I would caution you to avoid shredding your leaves by going over them with a mower. Raking will keep the leaves whole for the best cover and protect the insects and eggs already living there. Blowing leaves is definitely a bit less gentle, but still at least keeps the leaves whole. So you could kind of think of that as a step down from raking, which is a step down from leaving them totally undisturbed. All of these things, though, are a step up from mowing the leaves, bagging the leaves, or removing them from the yard altogether. So just sort of a spectrum of options that you can have. Doug Tallamy's group, Homegrown National Park, has some great posts about this and creative ways for using leaves. You can leave them where they fall. You can rake a layer into garden beds or pile them around trees to make new beds, mulch around some of your shrubs and perennials, use them in your compost, or pile them up for leaf jumping fun. Once they get up into sort of a big leaf pile or mulch pile, at a certain point, the the hot layer is no longer providing a great place for some of those insects. So I think in general, you're wanting to keep it to a few inches of leaves if you're wanting them for sort of a more traditional overwintering habitat for different kinds of insects. So more of the, mulching around garden beds. Thinking about mulch, mulch can be a really useful tool for weed control and moisture retention, but really thick and heavy layers of wood mulch can limit nesting sites. And plastic mulch is obviously totally impenetrable for something like a ground nesting bee. So when we do use mulch, other than leaves, we want to be doing so lightly or trying to leave at least some bare areas that ground nesting bees can get into. So if you're used to using wood mulch, if you're using it regularly, I would recommend, keeping that mulch to the first foot or so of beds to help with those encroaching weeds, but then leave some of the soil in the back of the beds open for bees to get into. And the leaf litter that we're talking about bringing into beds is really its own mulch. So you could also consider using leaves as mulch in pollinator gardens and heavy mulch in other areas like walking paths between beds. If that makes sense. I'm happy to take questions about mulch if that's confusing. Like all the other messier practices that we're recommending, if you're living in a neighborhood where a lot of people are managing their yards in a sort of typical HOA aesthetic, it can be really helpful to provide signage that explains what you're doing to people passing by. And I think more people every year know about leaving the leaves, but it's still kind of a new concept in some places. So we do have a sign available. There's other signs out there. Keep the leaves where you can, and then tell people why you're doing it. Often these are actually really helpful for, people walking by. They see what's going on. They want to ask you questions about it. It's a nice kind of conversation starter. So that's kind of a small introduction to leaving the leaves, which has been a bit of a paradigm shift for a lot of people. But putting gardens to bed for pollinators is actually a lot less work than how we might have learned how to clean up our gardens beforehand. Do you want to spend hours bagging leaves? I don't. So I'm happy. I'm happy to not be cleaning up my garden in that way. And the other insects and pollinators in the garden will be happier in that winter space. So let's talk about the second part of fall and winter management of our pollinator gardens, which is saving the stems. So if you have attended other of our webinars on pollinators, this is probably going to be familiar to you. But we have about 4,000 species of native wild living bees in the United States, and many of them live in the ground, but some of them live above ground. About 30% of our native bee species nest in plants, stems, and wood. So a small number, our bumblebees, nest in cavities. They're often nesting in things like abandoned mice burrows. Sometimes they'll nest above ground in a trunk that's got a cavity, like an old cavity. But they love those abandoned mice nests or under bunch grasses where they have some material they can use for warmth. But here are some of the types of bees that nest above ground in plant stems and wooden tunnels. So they range from really little tiny stem nesters like small carpenter bees, and then yellow-faced bees. Both of those are very, very small. And then there are larger tunnel nesters like mason and leafcutter bees. And those are the ones that you'll see using something like a bee hotel, a reed or a tunnel of that size. These are some examples of Ferritina, the small carpenter bee nests. These are these tiny little metallic green-blue bees in the same family as honeybees and bumblebees. They don't have much hair on their bodies. They kind of look like small little wasps, but you'll see them in many different types of plants in the summertime. They nest in stuff like blueberry, elderberry. They'll nest in bee balm stems, anise hyssop stems, a variety of these sort of stems that when you cut them off, you'll notice they have this kind of pithy hole in the middle. So they aren't usually able to bore in through tough woody stems. They need that pith to be exposed for them to move in. So in the spring, the female will dig down and start provisioning the base of the tunnel with pollen and nectar. Then she'll lay an egg and then use a little bit of the pith to make a partition or a wall in the nest, and then repeat the pollen and nectar provisioning for another egg, make another wall, and continue until she's filled up the stem. Some of them will then start a new nest in a new stem or twig. Others will actually just remain at the nest entrance and guard that stem entrance from predators, and then periodically kind of inspect and clean their brood. So depending on the species. Sometimes females and sisters will share guarding duties at the nest entrance. There are some species of bees that also nest in rotting or decaying wood. So standing snags, logs, stumps, and brush piles, often things that we think we should clear out of residential spaces, are really important to nesting and overwintering habitat. So saving the standing trees as well, which can also be kind of an interesting thing to look at over time. Some of these wood nesting bees can chew cavities of their own with their jaws, but a lot of them are actually dependent on other insects for their nest cavity. Wood boring beetles, two things we often want to dead wood and wood boring beetles are two things we often want to get rid of, but are really important for these bees. So you may have boring beetles, but that means you have interesting bees. Rotting logs are providing resources for insects at all stages of their decomposition. So this is this beautiful metallic green sweat bee, Agachlora pura, a native solitary wood nesting bee, and it nests in this decaying and rotting wood. So if you want to see this kind of beautiful bee in your yard, keep some of that rotting wood around. So a lot of times I get questions about how to leave the leaves and save the stems. Leave the leaves is pretty self-explanatory, but I get a lot more detailed questions about saving the stems. Like, when do I cut them back? What do I cut back? So I'm going to try and walk through the process of how I do that in my yard. And this is from one of our resources that we can share as a follow-up. It's actually pretty easy to do once you kind of get used to the annual ritual of it. So here we are in the fall. What are we going to do right now? So what we want to do now is leave the new growth of flower stalks that grew this year intact and standing over the winter. So if you have a cone flower, let's say, and it put out a flower head this year, you want to leave that be for this winter. So doing less is going to be doing more. The other nice thing about that, think about those seed heads. Those are providing resources for things like finches and other birds that are coming in and eating the seeds. So in the spring, we will then cut those seed heads back. So cutting back the things that have grown this year, we're going to cut back next spring. They've then stood over the winter. Typically, bees will nest in that sort of first year growth. So you're opening up those piths, and I'm doing that at sort of different heights. I'm usually aiming for something like 8 inches up to maybe 16, 24 inches to provide those nest cavities for things like small carpenter bees the next year. I tend to err on sort of the side of cutting high so that they have as much room to tunnel in as possible. So the cleanup would happen in the spring. And then over the summer next year, new growth of the perennials are going to hide that stubble, and bee larvae are going to be developing in their nests in the cut dead stems. In the fall next year, again, you're going to leave those stems that grew next year standing. So anything that's got a seed head on any new growth, you're going to leave standing over the winter. Bees will then be hibernating in the cut dead stems that you do next spring. And then other insects and birds are using the standing plants and seed heads for food and shelter. The following spring after that, again, you cut back the new growth. And then the old stems where the bees were hibernating will begin to naturally decompose. So you're not wanting to trim those back unless you're really feeling desperate about it. Adult bees will emerge from those old stems and start nests in the newly cut dead stems or in other naturally occurring open stems. Hopefully this is making sense. It's really more simple once you start to get into the rhythm of it. So if you're looking to create habitat for stem nesting bees in this way, here's some of their preferred nesting plants. And again, this is in the resource that we can share afterwards. But some plants in the mint family, like bee balm and hyssop, some in the aster family, like purple coneflowers and sunflowers, goldenrod, and then some berry plants and shrubs are all highly used plants when there are open stems available. So if you're looking for stem nesters in your garden, look closely at the cut stems from these plants, and I would take a look at the updated plant lists on our website as well. They have a little icon to tell you if a species is the preferred stem nesting plant. This is part of this idea of year-round appeal. So leaving things, the new growth from this past summer standing over the winter are going to be providing cover, structure, and forage for birds and other wildlife that's still active in the winter. Shrubs and trees that keep their leaves over the winter also provide that cover from rain and snow. And then fruits and seeds can provide food into the winter months. Leaving stems standing can also add a lot of winter interest in the yard. Instead of sort of cut down and barren, these seasons can really be a time of beauty. So that's saving the stems. I'm going to turn a little bit now to talk about vegetable gardens and fall garden tasks. So this is a little bit different than how we're managing our pollinator gardens. There's a difference between cleaning up perennial wildflower beds and cleaning up your garden. Fall cleanup is an important part of pest and disease prevention in the vegetable garden. So if I'm going to be giving you homework, it's going to be in your vegetable gardens and not so much in your pollinator gardens. This is a place where it does make sense to remove the leaves and stems and fruits and other mature parts after the first frost. So lots of edible plants that are grown in our vegetable gardens do have disease and pest issues that can overwinter on plant debris. So if we're wanting to make our jobs easier next year in the garden, we're going to want to do a good job with sanitation at the end of the season this year. Composting that debris can be a good option, provided you're doing, good, hot, active management of your compost to kill that pathogen. If you're not actively managing your compost, most home compost piles don't reach a temperature to kill some of these overwintering, disease inoculum and that kind of thing. So I would say if you have a municipal composting option in Essex County, that's usually a better place for some of this type of plant debris. And another option is burning if that's legal in your area. It might not be in Essex County. I didn't check before the presentation. When it comes to native plants, less is more when it comes to management. But for things like backyard apple tree and other edible plants, it is really helpful to pay attention to pruning and nutrition and other cultural practices. You want to keep the area around the tree clean and free of fallen fruit and leaves and woody debris that you may have pruned out. This is actually something that I use. I have a backyard apple tree that is prone to a variety of pest and disease issues. And so I make my life easier by using a golf ball collector to just get the drops. And then I roll it back and forth, get the apple drops, and then put them in a wheelbarrow and then compost them. So it doesn't work very well once they've started decomposing. So it's good to just kind of stay on top of it. Even better to just pick the fruit off the tree before it drops. but I haven't been that great about that this year. Um, One option for disease prevention as well is to flail mow the leaves. So we talked about not mowing the leaves for things that were, our native trees and other things that are dropping leaves and having overwintering insects on them. In this case, if we have an apple tree or something else that's prone to certain diseases, mowing the leaves is a good option for cutting the life cycles of things that are overwintering on those leaves to reduce inoculum of diseases and overwintering pests. So these are kind of the two flip sides of gardening. Um, this is my son in our garden. One of the other things that's helpful in disease prevention to make our lives easier next year is to do a good job disinfecting our garden tools to prevent disease-causing pathogens from spreading. So cleaning tools by washing off the soil, disinfecting them, and drying them off. These are some of the things to add to the fall garden task list. Then you can start thinking too about crop rotation and breaking pest and disease cycles for next year by rotating what is present in different beds of the garden for next year. There's really a rhythm to tending a native landscape as well as a vegetable garden. Both become kind of a familiar ritual. So you're wanting to stay on top of weeding in the vegetable garden in the fall because the weeds left there are going to go to seed and produce new weeds that you don't want to have to pull next year. But on the flip side, the fall is an excellent time to collect seeds for the plants that you do want in your yard. So this is where I can say it's absolutely possible to collect, store, and grow out native seeds from your property, especially if you're, not wanting to have to spend hundreds of dollars going to the nursery every year. Collecting seeds from the plants that you like and already have, you can sort of grow them out yourself and grow more next year. And this is a great option at this time of year. There's some really helpful webinars and other resources out there on how to collect and grow out native seeds. So there's lots of things you could be looking at online. I would recommend, if you're wanting to go out beyond your yard and do wild seed collections, I would Google the Bureau of Land Management's Seeds of Success program, which has collection protocols and guidance to help guide ethical collection from wild plant communities. But if that's something you're wanting to bring in some other native species from your area, think about how many to take and from what populations. And I would go do a little bit of looking around at resources on seed collection. But this is really a great and cheaper option for bringing more native species into your yard or sort of propagating out the ones that you already have. In your vegetable garden, fall is a good time to plant some cover crops and add amendments like compost and disease-free garden waste. Cover crops like this can help protect the soil and also keep weeds out from falling from other areas of the yard. Some are also providing some pest and disease control. So this is one of the things that I think about at this time of year in the vegetable garden. One of the things I didn't know as a young gardener was that fall is often a great time to plant. I thought spring was always going to be the best time to plant, but in some places, including up here, fall can be a great time to plant perennials and trees and shrubs. In your perennial garden, it's a good time for planting herbs and garlic around the yard. This is a great time to plan and plant for pollinators. So fall into winter is, if you are thinking about seeding a meadow, for example, fall into winter is a great time to seed those perennial wildflower seeds. You can do dormant seeding, where seeds then sit out through the frost and freeze-thaw cycles and help break those seeds out of dormancy and then germinate in the spring. It's also a good time for our, tree and shrub plantings if you're doing that. This is a nice time that's not going to stress some of those species out. They still need to get water, but they don't get that immediate heat. It's better to plant them now than it was in the heat of summer. Dormant season is also the time of year that I spend reflecting on my garden and making plans for next year. What plants really worked well this year? What did I have blooming that I, really was enjoying? Maybe want to bring a little bit more of it in. Are there things that are missing? Last year, as I was looking at my yard, I realized there's still kind of this period of time in early June when I don't have anything blooming. And my intention for next year is figuring out what can I plant? Probably going to be a woody plant of some kind to try and fill in some of that period where there's not a lot blooming in my yard. I want to make sure that it's someplace that a bee could be living for every day of the year and through the growing season and have something available for them. So I'm going to start making those plans for next year. My approach to pollinator gardening is really slow and continuous improvement, kind of like planning for retirement. It would be great to do it all at once, but that's really hard to do. So I try and just add a little bit more every year. So one of the other things I'm hoping we can share as a follow-up is this habitat assessment guide. This is a guide that helps you figure out and zero in on what you might be missing on your yard, kind of assess what's there, think about what improvements could be made, both in terms of flowering habitat as well as this nesting and overwintering habitat we've been talking about. One of the things, like I mentioned, early spring is a vulnerable period for emerging bumblebee queens. They're all on their own, seeking a nest site, building up pollen stores. So the quality and quantity of pollen available to bumblebee queens in that early period is really important for driving the growth and development of their colonies through the season. So a good start for a bumblebee can help them win the race. Early spring in New England is also a vulnerable time because of the variability we have in weather conditions. Sometimes it'll be really warm and then all of a sudden we'll get a hard frost, particularly with the erratic nature of climate change. So we can't solve climate change, but what we can do is make sure we have as diverse a set of resources available as possible. Plant a diversity of woody plants and perennials that bloom in the early spring to try and build more resilience into that system. Woody species are usually the first to bloom, but spring ephemerals and other early blooming forbs are also helpful. That's one of the reasons I really want to fill that gap in late May and early June in my yard. Okay, the last thing I'm going to mention about fall and winter garden tasks before we kind of wrap up here is this actually can be a good time of year to interrupt some other pest cycles outside of your vegetable garden. So unfortunately, the spotted lanternfly was detected in Essex County this year. This is the time of year that this species is laying eggs. Egg masses look like this kind of flat surface on the right, and they can be found on many different kinds of outdoor surfaces from October through June. So if you've ever seen a lanternfly or you tried to catch it when it's an adult, you know that they are big and they move really fast. So the part of their life cycle that's easiest to interrupt is the one where they're not moving. Winter is the best time to find spotted lanternfly egg masses and then drop them into a Ziploc bag with some hand sanitizer and throw them in the trash. So that's, you also, one of the ways they've been moving around is on vehicles. So sometimes there'll be egg masses on cars and they move in between states that way as well. So that's one thing to now be looking out for in Essex County. So we're getting close to wrapping up. Just a quick recap. Do clean up your vegetable gardens. Don't clean up your perennial gardens and leave stems standing over the winter. Let the birds have them and let the insects have them. So thinking broadly, you don't need to do it all at once. Every gardener is going to keep tinkering and figuring out what works. Work on it in easy to do chunks. Take time to enjoy what you've created and see what works. It's really a fun experiment of trial and error to see what's going to work in the rhythm of your garden, and also what plants are going to do best in the conditions that you have. So you'll figure out what grows well, where bees are going to nest, what butterflies you have, and so on. If you're used to that really intense fall cleanup, the mowing and the bagging and the cleaning up, or even simply used to lawn, moving to the messier looking garden takes some getting used to. I have some very messy patches out in my yard, goldenrod, stinging nettles, hairy white aster. My husband's like, do you want to clean that up? And my response is usually just, let's wait. Let's just pause here for a minute and take a look at it. There comes the finch coming into the goldenrod. There's the bumblebees coming in on the goldenrod, on the coneflower. What is there that you might not see that's hidden in the thatch or under the soil? Let's let it be. Let's let it enjoy its life. So it takes a shift in perspective, but you can really come to enjoy the signs of life that are present in the yard. You are putting out food for wildlife. let's let them eat it, right? Your garden's going to be chewed up, munched on, nested in, burrowed in. It's going to have that lived in look. So let's get used to it. Let's pull up a chair and watch. Let's share that with our neighbors as well, with the signage and the conversations. And then let's think about what we might not want to do. Instead of saying, hey, there's something eating my plants, let me grab the spray. Let's say, hey, what caterpillar is that? What's it going to become as an adult? That's one of the amazing things about some of those smartphone tools like iNaturalist or Picture This or those types of apps. It helps you see what that insect is and what it's going to become and learn something about its life cycle. So really great tools for becoming more observant naturalists in our yards. Because if we want butterflies in our garden, we're going to need that caterpillar in our gardens. And if we want birds in our yard, we are going to need insects in our yard. So having that chewed up and munched on and lived in space is a really good sign that you're building that healthy ecosystem and that resilient ecosystem in your yard. So I covered a lot of ground today. I'm hoping we have time for questions. But if you are interested in any particular topic, Xerces has a ton of resources on plants, pollinators, habitat restoration, monarchs on our website. So there's a regional pollinator conservation center on the website. You can go to the Northeast and there's lots of different things you can download from there. This is one of those ones that I'm hoping we can follow up by email with everybody who's participated today. This is more info on what plants you could plant for stem nesting bees and how to manage them. And finally, we are a donor-supported nonprofit, and membership funding is what allows me to take on outreach presentations like this. So thank you to the donors out there, and thank you to our members for making this possible. So with that, I will take any questions.
Emily, thank you so much. This was such a valuable presentation. I love the shift in perspective. And, if we just take time to see what's on some of these plants and what's eating them, I know for myself, it's become this joyous journey to go out and look and what's happening in the yard today. I liked also the slow and steady, like your retirement account, because sometimes you can get overwhelmed saying, "But I need to have this and this and this." It's like just slow and steady, and building those plants and putting in that spring penstemon, and that's going to get those early pollinators. And I know we do have some questions. Patricia, if you want to lead us off.
Sure. So a question I often have, and which Kathy is asking, is when is it safe in the springtime to remove the leaves?
So I think, yeah, I see actually two questions in here, which is when in spring can I start cutting back and when is it safe to remove the leaves? And I think there's two different answers to those two different questions. So I think you could, for cutting back in the spring, for opening up plant stems, I usually aim for when, ambient temperatures have risen up a little bit. But really, if you're just cutting back the new growth from this past summer, it doesn't really matter because there won't be bees nesting in those stems, if that makes sense. The new growth that happened this summer, so let's say your cone flowers with a seed head on top of them, you can cut those back anytime in the spring because it's very unlikely that there will be bees nesting in them. It's the stems from last year that you might have cut that would have bees nesting in them. And again, this is something you can look at the Save the Stems resource and just take a look at those graphics and get a little better sense of that. For the leaves, ideally you would actually just be letting them break down because those different insects that are present in the leaves, many of them are present through the seasons. So there's not really a time to remove those that isn't going to be disturbing some kind of insect present in the leaves. So, one of the options is if you just have too many leaves to leave throughout the season, you can, rake off and compost some portion of them, but you'll still have emergence from whatever leaves you are able to leave behind. So what I would try to do is just take the leaves, mow them, not mow them, sorry, rake them gently into your garden beds and then let them break down there. Don't take them out at any point. Take some portion of your leaves and make sure that they are left pretty much undisturbed for the rest of the time. Just let them break down naturally. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
think
it
so.
sure does.
Great.
So Sally's asking, she's had too much of a good thing, which is they established a wonderful and successful pollinator garden, but now they have so many seeds and it's self-seeding that it's become a problem. So what should they do?
Mm. Oh, interesting. So maybe there's certain species that are driving this. There are certain self-sowing species that are getting into the community garden. Is that what I'm sort of hearing from the question?
And that's how I read it, yes.
Yeah. So if you have certain species that you're seeing as problematic for the nearby community garden, I think you would be able to get away with cutting those back in the fall before they become a problem for the garden. So I think that's a specific sort of site specific problem, right? You have maybe a neighbor who's not wanting you to have your seeds rain down on their garden because then they're having to pull, let's say, fleabane or something over and over again from their garden beds. And that makes sense. I mean, one way you could work with it would be seeing if you could plant a cover crop on folks' gardens in the community garden bed to try and keep some of the seed rain out. Um, but otherwise, if you have certain kind of species that tend to be the problems for sowing into your neighbor's yard or your community garden bed, you could cut those back before they go to seed, or you could collect, the seeds off of them and sow them somewhere where they're not going to be a problem for a neighbor.
Thank you. Another concern that I think we all have is that what are your concerns about jumping worms, whether in leaf litter or the soil?
Yeah, jumping worms are tough. I think on an ecosystem level, they are really a threat to ecosystem health for our leaf litter and things that live in the leaf litter because they break it down so quickly that there's less winter cover for the things that depend on leaf litter. So on an ecosystem level, they're really a problem. On an individual yard level, one of the things that we can do to be more resilient to jumping worms is to plant exactly the kinds of species we're already trying to plant for pollinators. Those deep-rooted prairie plants are quite resilient to jumping worms. So they can actually be a barrier. So if you don't have jumping worms now, the best thing that you can do is prevention. So being really careful about nursery plants that you're bringing in, any kind of outside mulch, any kind of outside compost, that's where jumping worms are moving in. But one of the things you can do for prevention, if let's say they're in your neighborhood, but not in your yard yet, is planting perennial prairie type species that have those deep roots, grasses, silphiums, the cup plant and compass plant, other things that have really deep root systems around the outside of your yard as almost like a barrier to the jumping worms coming in because they're feeding on primarily and damaging primarily the shallow rooted species and the leaf litter itself. So what I will warn you against is going too far with the sort of garden forum recommendations on how to manage jumping worms. I wouldn't be pouring a ton of tea seed meal. I wouldn't be pouring a ton of mustard on the yard because it does affect other insects and it does affect, if it gets into surface water nearby, it can have impacts on amphibians. So I think jumping worms are going to be here to stay. We can try and learn to manage them, in our raised bed settings and in smaller targeted areas where we don't want them. But on a large yard scale, I wouldn't be going in and trying to really do jumping worm management. I would be thinking about planting those deep-rooted plants that are more resilient to the damage they have. Does that make any follow-up questions on that one?
No, it makes
Not
sense.
on that one. I'm not sure, but I thought you answered the question. But again, Sally's question about the plants that were too successful, she wasn't talking about problem plants. She was talking about plants they planted that were just self-sowing to excess in their judgment.
Plants enjoying life in the garden too much. I see that.
Like anise hyssop, which I know
Yeah.
is wonderful pollinator plant, but it's like, whoa, look how many I have to give away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, that's a great example of what you could do. If you have species that are self-sowing too much, collect the seeds and give them away. That would be one way to try and do that. or replant the ones that are, divide and replant the ones that are just flourishing into another space that can take them.
Right.
And lastly, there's the question on, do you have a suggestion or do you know where one could find a good save the stem graphic for a yard sign?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. We don't have a Save the Stems one as of this point. My parents at one point had made a lot of homemade signs that they laminated and put up with like paragraphs of text, which were great for conversation starters, but not the most attractive yard signs. There's probably someone on Etsy who's made an attractive Save the Stems yard sign.
I wonder also the Tufts Pollinator. Look on their site. They may have something that Nick Dorian had done. But, you know, um, we will send out a link to this fabulous presentation and also some resources that Emily has talked about today. So you'll have more information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been a great way to spend a Thursday afternoon and so much wonderful information, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.